the one thing I'd like to say about the evidence in these cases is that the evidence is not the problem. We have ample evidence. You can see from the video clips how compelling some of the video clips are. We chose to blur the faces of potential suspects in the case, but we have the footage which shows their faces. The evidence is not the problem. The problem is holding Israel to account, Israel holding, the international community holding Israel to account, and the failure in doing that. And we thought we'd also play a few words from Shireen, as you saw at the end of that clip, so she could posthumously explain her role and what she was doing. I'd like to introduce Jennifer Robinson. Jennifer is an international law barrister at Doughty Street Chambers and instructor to act in our ICC complaint. Jennifer will discuss the legal strategies for accountability in response to the targeting of Palestinian journalists, including our recent ICC complaint, and provide an overview of our clients' cases. Jennifer.
Thank you, Tayyab, and good morning, everyone. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Dr. Tatiana Eatwell, who's the head of our Doughty Street International team, we welcome you to Chambers this morning and thank you all for coming. It's an honour and a privilege for us to be instructed to represent Shireen Abu Akleh, Ali Samoudi and Shada Hanassia. We pay tribute to Shireen Abu Akleh and her work in a world where there are too few prominent women journalists, and we thank her bereaved family for entrusting us with taking her case to the ICC. We also pay tribute to Ali Samoudi, who was shot and seriously injured in the same incident, and Shada Hanassia, who was shot at and witnessed the killing. They survived an incredibly traumatic event, and we want to ensure that through our international advocacy and our work, that their cases also receive the international attention that they deserve. We will now be joining all of these journalists as victims in the complaint that we filed to the ICC in April about the targeting of Palestinian journalists by Israeli forces. That complaint, as Tayyab mentioned, was originally filed on behalf of 4 named journalists: Ahmed Abu Hassan, Yasser Mataja, Muat Amaneh, and Nedal Eshtaye. Each of them were killed or maimed by Israeli snipers while reporting. All of these journalists, like Shireen Abu Akleh, were shot while clearly wearing marked press vests and press helmets. Our complaint also details the deliberate targeting and bombing of media infrastructure in Gaza in May 2021. As we warned in our ICC complaint back in April, the attacks on Palestinian journalists by the Israeli Defence Force have been widespread and systematic, and the threat of ongoing attacks against journalists is clear. Sadly, Shireen Abu Akleh's murder is a clear demonstration of the ongoing threat posed to journalists and Palestinian journalists reporting in the occupied territories, and the urgent need to address impunity for these attacks. This is precisely what our ICC complaint sets out to do, to ensure those who are responsible are held accountable, and this is why we submit that the ICC prosecutor should investigate and prosecute those responsible. Can we sort out the sound?
Sorry about this.
Sorry about this, guys. Have anyone who can try and sort out the sound? Yeah. Sorry? I don't know. I've got that many journals. Yeah.
Sorry about this, everybody. We'll just take a few moments to fix this feedback loop.
Maybe this.
I'll turn mine. I don't think it's... Oh, no, it wasn't you.
Well,
It was
I don't know.
Click
Okay,
on-
we can continue.
apologise for that. Sorry, Jennifer. Would you like to continue?
Sure. Our ICC complaint sets out to hold those responsible and to ensure that they're held accountable. This is why that we submit the ICC prosecutor must investigate our complaints and prosecute those responsible to send a clear message not just to the Israeli forces and government, but to all governments that targeting journalists is a crime and journalists are not fair game. Today I want to cover 3 brief points in relation to our legal work. First, provides a short bit of background about our work with the ICJP and the IFJ and PJS, a little bit about our international legal strategy, and some information about our clients, the legal case, and next steps. We first began working on this back in 2019 with the IFJ. The targeting of journalists in the context of armed conflict is an increasing global trend, and one that we've sadly seen in the context of the conflict in the Ukraine. Journalists play an essential role at the front lines, providing us an objective account of what's happening on the front line and documenting war crimes and human rights abuse. Sadly, this means that this is also why journalists become the target for governments who wish to hide the truth and to cover up war crimes and enable impunity. This has long been a problem for Palestinian journalists. The Journalists' Local and International Union, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate, and the International Federation of Journalists has long and for many years been condemning the targeting and killing of Palestinian journalists and the broader discrimination and obstacles they face in doing their work as journalists on that front line. To give a brief overview of the issue, the extent of the problem and what prompted our work, I want to give you some facts. Back in 2019, a UN Commission of Inquiry into the 2018 protests found that 2 journalists, 2 of our clients, were killed while wearing press vests and 39 others were injured by live ammunition. The following year, in 2019, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate reported that 200 journalists had been physically attacked and dozens more were injured by rubber-coated bullets and live ammunition. And yet, in response to these attacks on Palestinian journalists, there were no investigations and no prosecutions. No one has been held accountable. And as a result of that impunity, the attacks continue. When we commenced our work in 2018, our aim was to work with the unions, victim journalists and their bereaved families to file international complaints and conduct international advocacy to both the UN and to the ICC to highlight the need to end this impunity and to protect the important work of journalists on the front line. We also wanted to make clear the legal position, and I do so today. The deliberate targeting of journalists is, in all situations, a grave violation of the right to life under international human rights law, and in situations of armed conflict that includes occupation, a violation of international humanitarian law and a war crime. As civilians in armed conflict, journalists are not legitimate targets. The deliberate targeting of journalists is not just a war crime, but in our view it's a war crime to cover up other war crimes, to cover up and prevent reporting on conflict and on war crimes themselves. In this work, we also wanted to make sure that we raise the targeting of freelance journalists in particular, those who work and those who work for smaller media organisations. Too often they are targeted without the benefit of large international media organisations to do advocacy on their behalf. So sadly, the recent killing of Shireen Abu Akleh shows that working for a large international media organisation provides no protection for journalists. In working with the IFJ, we identified the 4 first cases which we believe are emblematic of the broader problem of targeting of journalists in Palestine. You've seen on the video those 4 journalists. The first 2 were killed during the 2018 protests. Ahmad Abu Hussein, a 24-year-old journalist who was fatally shot in the abdomen by an IDF sniper. He had been taking photographs of the demonstrations and was clearly wearing a blue helmet and a press vest. Yasser Mataja was a 30-year-old photographer and media company owner who had also been wearing a blue press vest when he was shot and lethally wounded while filming demonstrations for a documentary. Both of their cases were investigated and highlighted by the UN Commission of Inquiry in 2019, which concluded that they were both killed while wearing press vests. The UN inquiry also concluded that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers had shot them intentionally. Our clients also include 2 journalists who were maimed and lethally targeted. Muath Armaneh is a 33-year-old journalist and photographer who was shot in the eye in 2019 by the IDF while wearing a bulletproof vest with a press logo and, again, a press helmet. He had to have multiple surgeries to remove the shrapnel from his eye and, in fact, to remove his eye. But he continues to suffer physically and psychologically and hasn't been able to continue his work or protect and provide for his family. He made a police report to Palestinian authorities in Bethlehem. The Israeli authorities never asked him for a statement, and there's been no investigation to our knowledge. Nedal Eshtayeh is a 53-year-old freelance journalist. He was shot in 2015 with a rubber bullet in the eye while filming the soldier who shot him. He'd been wearing his press vest and a helmet. He suffered nerve atrophy, loss of vision, and requires continuing treatment. After there was no criminal investigation, he did seek reparations in the Israeli courts, a civil claim to seek compensation for the shooting, but the Israeli courts determined that they had immunity from that suit. His work continues, but at great risk. He was shot again in 2021. These two cases demonstrate the problem that we're identifying in our complaint, which is the immense difficulty for Palestinian journalist victims to seek reparations and justice in the Israeli courts. And this is why we say the ICC complaint is so necessary. We are instructed by each of the journalists who were targeted, or on behalf of their bereaved family members. We pay tribute to each of them and to their families for taking action to try to protect other journalists. We also pay tribute to the work of the unions who really initiated this work, the Palestinian Journalists Syndicate and the International Federation of Journalists, for their invaluable support for Palestinian journalists and media workers, and for their families to enable this work to take place. As Tayyab mentioned, our first line of international advocacy was to make a UN complaint to the UN Special Rapporteurs at the end of 2020. To that complaint, we have had no response. After the ICC prosecutor announced her investigation in early 2021, we started working with the ICJP to put together our ICC complaint on behalf of those 4 journalists. Soon afterwards, we saw the deliberate targeting and bombing of the towers in Gaza in May 2021, and we added that targeting to the ICC complaint. This week, we have been instructed by Shireen Abu Akleh's family, along with the other journalists targeted in that incident, to add them to our ICC complaint and our broader international advocacy. Just briefly on the ICC complaint, it was filed under Article 15 of the Rome Statute, requesting that the prosecutor, Karim Khan, open an investigation under Article 53 of the statute. Our complaint alleges various war crimes under Article 8 and crimes against humanity on the basis of the widespread and systematic nature of the targeting of Palestinian journalists. We submit that these complaints are admissible because of the repeated failure of the Israeli authorities to properly investigate and prosecute those responsible, and because of the gravity of their offences. In terms of next steps, we will soon be adding Shireen Abu Akleh's cases and the other cases to our ICC complaint. It's important to recognise that the UN and international community has long known about this problem. We want to highlight today the cumulative effect of the ongoing impunity for Israeli forces, and that is the continuing attack on journalists. Action must be taken to ensure that Israel observes its international obligations under international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We say that it's important because, not just because Shireen Abu Akleh's of her case, which is of course high profile, but it is not a one-off. There is a repeated pattern of targeting of journalists, and this has to stop. If this impunity continues, journalists will continue to be killed, which is why the IFJ and the PJS initiated this work to protect media workers. It's time for the ICC to take action to send a clear message to the Israeli government and to all governments that targeting journalists is not fair game. Thank you very much.